Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for this webinar is Solar+Storage for public and affordable housing. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, and is being presented as a part of our Sustainable Solar Education Project, which is supported by the U.S. Department of Energy Solar Energy Technologies Office. We have with us some excellent guest speakers today. And we also have with us our host for this webinar, Nate Hausman. Nate is a project director here at CESA. Before I pass it over to all of them for our presentations, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode for this webinar. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can call in using a telephone, or you can connect using your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can see the presentation full screen, you can click on the little red or orange arrow that you see circled here. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions and your comments as you think of them throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on the webinar console and hitting send. We will be reading through your questions throughout the webinar as they come in, and we'll save about 15 minutes at the end of our presentations for a Q&A with the audience. And we do expect to have a lot of people on the line today, so we should have a lot of questions. In order to make sure that we get to your question, type it in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email probably this afternoon with a link to all of the webinar materials, a copy of the slides and the recording. And we'll also post those on our website along with all of our other archived webinars. And you can find that at cesa.org/webinars. So with that out of the way, I would like to get the webinar started by passing it over to our host for today, Nate Hausman. Nate.
Thank you, Samantha. So today's webinar, as Samantha said, is on Solar+Storage for public and affordable housing. And before we get into the content, I just briefly want to tell you about who we are and why we're doing this webinar. So the Clean Energy States Alliance, or CESA, is a national nonprofit network of public agencies and organizations working together to advance clean energy. And you can see some of our members on this slide. We're mostly made up of state agencies. And this webinar, as Samantha said, is being conducted as part of our Sustainable Solar Education Project, and that's a CESA-run project to help state and municipal officials ensure that distributed solar remains consumer-friendly and benefits low and moderate income households. And it's funded through the U.S. Department of Energy Solar Energy Technologies Office. Next, yeah. And through the project, we've developed a lot of educational resources on solar consumer protection and solar equitability. You can see a series of guides that we produced under the project on the right-hand side of this slide. We also do a bunch of webinars like this one. We produce a free monthly e-newsletter which covers news and resources from across the country on solar equitability and consumer protection. And we also do some in-person workshops. And in fact, today's webinar grew out of an in-person workshop we conducted in October on solar for public and affordable housing in Denver. Our webinar for today is in part designed to help us reach a broader audience with some of the content from that workshop. And last week we conducted a webinar on financing solar projects for public and affordable housing, and you can find a recording of that webinar on CESA's website. But for today's webinar, we've got 3 speakers and a 4th, Andy Manley from Promise Energy, who will join us for the Q&A at the end. In the interest of time, I won't do a full intro for Andy now, but I will briefly introduce our 3 presenters, and then I'll turn it over to them. So our first presenter for today is Seth Mullendore. Seth is Vice President and Project Director for Clean Energy Group, where he serves as Manager, Analyst, and Technical Advisor for power systems, solar PV applications, and battery storage projects. Prior to joining Clean Energy Group, Seth served as a Sustainable Energy Fellow with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Seth holds an MS in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Stanford University and a BS in Geosciences from the University of Southern Maine. Our second speaker for today will be Rob Sanders. Rob serves as senior finance director for Clean Energy Group. Rob was formerly the managing director for energy finance for the Reinvestment Fund, serving as fund manager for the Sustainable Development Fund, a $32 million fund created by the Pennsylvania PUC to promote renewable energy and energy efficiency, as well as TRF fund manager for the Pennsylvania Green Energy Loan Fund and the Philadelphia Metropolitan Area Energy Works Loan Fund. Rob holds an MCP from the University of California at Berkeley and a BA from Stanford University. And finally, we have Jonas Villalba. Jonas serves as Vice President of Project Development for Promise Energy, where he provides system sizing and design, pre-engineering, bidding, site assessment, estimation, and technology selections for commercial solar PV battery storage projects. Jonas is a master solar designer and licensed journeyman plumber, and he has over 20 years of experience in design build contracting. So those are our three speakers for today. With that, I'll turn it over to Seth. Seth, the platform's yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Nate. And thank you all for joining us today. So I am going to give you a brief introduction about who I am and the work that Rob and I do, much of the work that we do through the Resilient Power Project, which is a project of Clean Energy Group. The goal of the project is to increase access for solar and energy storage systems for low income and otherwise disadvantaged communities. The project's been around for a little over 3 years now, really came in the wake of Superstorm Sandy and the widespread outages across the Northeast. In addition to providing resiliency in the form of backup power, the project also focuses on lowering the energy burden for low income communities. The project really works in a number of areas in policy and trying to get the right programs in place to enable greater access, and also on the project level as well, which is some of the information I'm going to pass along today. In addition to getting a lot of information out there, just like CESA does, we also help kind of facilitate the project development process and do have, through our foundation support, a small technical assistance fund to offset some of the pre-development costs for projects that are benefiting low-income communities. And you can check out our website, resilient-power.org, for a lot more information about what we're doing. This next slide just gives you kind of an example, a look into the kinds of projects that we are supporting across the country. At any time, we're really helping work with about 50 projects across the country, mostly located in the Northeast and in the West Coast, but also some projects in the middle of the country as well, really focusing on affordable housing and critical community facilities, which can be first responders or emergency shelters or anything that strengthens the community in an emergency situation. So now I'm going to get into the talk today, which is solar and storage for multifamily, public, and affordable housing. I'm not going to talk about solar too much because folks on the line probably know solar pretty well, and there's a lot more information out there. I'm going to focus on storage. There's a lot of different storage technologies, but I'm going to focus mainly on, or really solely on, battery technologies. There's also a lot of information out there about thermal storage. We're not going to get into that today. We're going to talk about solar combined with batteries. When you're talking about batteries, there are also a lot of technology solutions out there, but the two most common ones, and usually what projects are going to be looking at, is a choice between lithium-ion batteries and lead-acid batteries, which are shown examples here. Lithium-ion has been in the news a lot lately. The costs have really come down dramatically over the last few years, about 75% within the last decade. And with Tesla having their Powerwall and their systems, there's really been a lot of exposure for lithium-ion batteries. Lead-acid have been around for a long time. There's pretty much one in every car. So people are more familiar with that technology. The ones used for solar applications are different than the ones used in your car, but it's basically the same technology. And when choosing between the two, it's a number of factors that take into account. One is how the battery is going to be used. If you're going to be cycling the battery, charging it and discharging it a lot, multiple times a day or every day, lithium-ion may be a better choice because it has a lot more longevity when you're talking about the battery cycling, so how much it's being used. If you're talking about the cost of a project, and you think you're going to have applications where the battery's not used a lot, lead acid could be a more cost-effective choice. There are other things to take into account as well. Lithium-ion batteries have a lot higher energy density. So if you need a project where you need a lot of energy, you're going to take up a lot less space with lithium-ion than lead acid. So there are a number of factors, but those are just some of the top-level considerations when thinking about which technology to use. Most of the projects that we've worked with have chosen to go the lithium-ion route. It's a lot more flexible and kind of dynamic battery source, but it is more expensive than a lead acid. These are just a couple of actual examples of projects in low-income housing projects. So the one on the left there, you're looking at a project in California, and this is an outside battery enclosure. The battery is the last box you see there. Battery installations aren't the most exciting thing to look at. They're usually a bunch of boxes connected by wires. So that's about a 14 kilowatt hour battery, I believe, in there. The one on the right side is you're looking at a Sonnen battery, and that's in a redeveloped mobile home park that is now net zero single family homes. This is a smaller battery located indoors. It takes up less space. It's about a 6 kilowatt hour battery, so about half the capacity as the other battery. So when talking about the economic case for solar and storage in affordable housing, what we really focus on in our work is the savings that you can get. This is the biggest opportunity for storage right now as far as being economically viable. There are a lot of other cases to put in storage, such as resiliency itself, but if you're trying to make it pencil out the economics alone, demand charge management is one of the things you're looking at. For those not familiar, when you look at an energy bill for the commercial side of a property, for a multifamily property, most properties are going to have energy charges, which people are pretty familiar with. Those are kilowatt hour charges. Fixed charges, which is just a monthly fee that you pay every month. And then there's demand charges, which is usually based on the peak demand that a building has for a billing period. And that's measured in kilowatts. I'll go into that a little bit more in a minute. Here's just an example of kind of looking at an illustration of the difference between consumption and demand. If you look at the building A all the way on the left side and building B, they use different amounts of energy throughout the day. It's showing the yellow squares are showing lights on. So building A uses a lot of energy throughout the day, and building B uses a lot midday, but not so much morning and night. So while their consumption differs, building A consumes more energy, their demand is the same. And that's because during midday, building B is using as much energy at the same time as building A. So they're going to have the same peak demand and the same demand charges if they're on the same rate. The last one there just shows how energy storage, you can store maybe some of your energy in the morning, use more in the morning to charge up the battery, then discharge it midday, and that can lower that peak demand. I'll show that graphically in a minute as well. So who pays demand charges? A lot of multifamily, larger ones particularly, will pay demand charges for the commercial side. So for common area loads or master meter buildings, offices, laundry spaces, things like that are often on these commercial billing rate structures. So nearly all medium to large commercial customers in every state pay demand charges. And it's not just businesses, as I'm saying, that's public buildings, community facilities, and multifamily housing. As I said, this is based on your peak demand, so the highest amount of demand that you use it at any point, usually over a 15-minute period throughout a billing period. Demand is not always billed the same. There's a lot of variations, but that's the basic concept. A lot of people don't realize that the demand can generally make up 30 to 70% of a customer's monthly electric bill. Depends on what kind of rate tariff you're under, but as a rule, that tends to be kind of where demand charges lie for a lot of customers. So here's an example, just graphically showing how batteries can lower peak demand and can lower demand charges. So basically, the top line there is showing a day's worth of demand, energy usage throughout the day. So the area under that would be the consumption, and the line shows the peak demand in kilowatts. The red areas are showing cases where the battery is actually discharging to hold the peak demand at a managed demand threshold. So basically the battery is saying, whenever demand approaches this threshold, we're going to discharge the energy in that system to make sure that demand doesn't go above that level, and we hold our peak demand at around 65 kilowatts instead of going up in the 100 kilowatt range. The break-even point, a number of studies have shown for energy storage, particularly lithium-ion batteries, to make sense for this. It's about $15 per kilowatt is the rate structure that you're under. In this case, if you were able to do this every month, that would add up to about $6,000 in annual savings. So I want to look at a couple of real-world case studies for how these economics play out. This is Boston Housing Authority. This data is actually a little bit old, so the economics are going to look better today than they did at the time that we did the analysis. As you can see here that, if you can see the numbers in the graph, that you add solar and you end up with about 11% savings. The information at the bottom shows you end up with about a 6-year payback for the solar system. Energy storage, the overall savings bump up to 14% savings. Not a huge increase, but if you look at the energy storage line in the graph below, in the chart below, the payback is actually quicker than the solar. So 4.4 years, leading to a combined system, simple payback of around 5 years. So it actually reduces the payback of the project. This is looking at using the investment tax credit for both the solar and the energy storage, but no additional incentives in this case. So there are no additional incentives for the energy storage system. This is just based on the ITC and makers, the federal tax credits for those systems, and no other incentives. Another case study that we looked at, again, this has been almost 2 years now since we looked at this, but this is looking at an actual affordable housing project in Southern California, looking at their utility bills and their rate structure. Solar, if you you can offset the complete energy consumption with solar, so that results in about 55% savings, still leaving almost half the bill between demand charges and fixed charges. Deploying energy storage, in this case, is actually able to pretty much wipe out the commercial side of the building. That's because energy storage was able to drop the peak demand or the demand for the building below a certain threshold where they didn't have to pay demand charges anymore. So really, they just would be paying the fixed charges each month. And as you can see in the graph below, or the chart below, solar has about 8.5-year payback. The battery storage had 2.5 years. So it really reduced the overall payback period for the project. In this case, there are additional incentives because it's in California. They have what's called the self-generation incentive program. So it's an incentive that is specifically geared towards behind-the-meter energy storage. So energy storage at the customer site, affecting the customer's bill directly. Just in case you're wondering, where I'm located, are there demand charges and are there high demand charges? This is from a report that we released a white paper with the National Renewable Energy Lab that surveyed demand charges over 10,000 utility rates across the country. So the darker the shading, the higher the demand charges. As you can see, demand charges are in existence in every state to varying degrees of the maximum level of the chart. So California, and if you look at New York and parts of Massachusetts, Long Island in particular in New York, have very high demand charges. But a lot of other areas across the country, parts of Michigan, Florida, places in Georgia and New Mexico, you see pretty high demand charges scattered around the country, just depending on the utility territory. That's what these shapes are. They signify the utility territory. So it can give you a sense of where demand charges are and where energy storage might make sense economically. I wanted to get into two last points here before I turn things over to Rob. One is from a report that we looked at, looking at solar risk in California. Basically, California has changed some of their net metering policies and are in the process of changing some of their tariff structures that will potentially erode the value of solar to customers over time. Partly this is through shifting time of use rates so that the peak pricing period is in the evening when solar isn't producing anymore and electricity costs more. Some is what's called non-bypassable charges that are applied to any exported energy, and then there are increasing demand charges. So when we looked at that, it was over a 50% reduction in the value that a solar system can provide over time. And looking at what happened when energy storage was added to a project, you could increase the savings to recoup those losses. The first graph there shows the drop in savings. The gray bar is the after the measures are implemented. And when you move over to the next graph over, you can see through some time shifting of energy with energy storage and reduced demand charges, you're able to recoup the losses that you would have through those policy and tariff changes. Now, if you were able to switch tariffs like I showed you in that one and get rid of demand charges altogether, it's a really significant increase, over 3 times as much the savings as you could before the policy changes with solar, you get with solar and storage combined. The other thing I wanted to talk about just really briefly is the value of resilience. This is another paper that we did with the National Renewable Energy Lab, just looking at if you could come up with a good methodology of placing a value on resilience, which everyone agrees resiliency has a value, but it's very hard to quantify and hard to monetize. If you're able to do that, and NREL figured out a way to do that for some properties, you can see that in the case of this example, a large hotel, when there was no value on resilience, no PV or battery system was deemed to be economic, so they would not provide any additional value to the project. But the lower numbers, when you did put a value on resilience, the optimal system sizing did build a PV system and did choose to build an energy storage system, leading to a net present value of $50,000 for this project. So just something to keep in mind, that while there's not always an easily monetizable value to resilience, something that should be factored into projects, and there are some state programs in certain areas that will provide some grants for resiliency projects. We've seen that in Massachusetts. I'm not going to get into this too much. This is talking about paying for battery storage. Rob's going to get this in more. But basically, there's the savings I talked about, which is demand charges or more self-consumption, time of use rate shifting, revenue, which I didn't get into here, but in some places there are grid services that could be provided by energy storage or the combination of solar and storage to generate additional revenue. There are the federal incentives that I talked about, which is the investment tax credit when paired with solar, and almost been predominantly charged with solar. You can get the ITC and makers for the energy storage as well. And then some states have incentive programs. California and Massachusetts are examples of states that have programs that are in place that will incentivize energy storage. So with that, I am going to turn things over to my colleague, Rob, to talk more about financing these projects.
Great. Thanks, Seth. I appreciate that. So one major aspect of our work is to understand and write about the issues and opportunities related to financing resilient power in low-income communities. We've released a number of finance papers and reports, including those listed here. You can find them all posted on our website, which is resilient-power.org. So how are solar and storage projects being financed today? At this point in the market, we're seeing that state and local incentives remain very important for low and moderate income community projects, whether it's affordable housing or other community critical community facilities. And I think states that have very strong programs are Massachusetts and California and Washington, D.C. And they're as important are the federal tax credits and tax advantages that are available to solar installation, solar PV, but also to battery storage if the batteries are charged primarily from the solar PV systems. And so the battery storage can also receive 30% investment tax credit treatment. And there's also no reason why solar and storage assets can't be financed with LIHTC, the low-income housing tax credit programs. So we're seeing that happen as well. Utilities are involved in the financing of these projects through the incentives in some territories, utility territories. For instance, Con Ed in New York has a very strong incentive program where there's congested grid circuits, particularly in Brooklyn and Queens portions of New York City. But also, utilities can own or contract for services for third parties to provide solar and storage, which they then benefit from as far as providing grid services. Solar and storage companies, there are a lot of early stage companies that are using project finance funds or venture capital and private equity to complete their projects. And then there are large energy service companies that have access to capital markets and are particularly focused on commercial and industrial customers, and MUSH market, the municipalities and universities and schools and hospitals. AES, for instance, which has a long track record in doing storage projects, has now partnered with Siemens to create Fluence, a new entity about a year old, which allows for the storage pipeline of projects to be built all over the world. And Schneider Electric has also done a lot of work in the C&I markets. Bond financing for municipal projects, public housing, schools, large nonprofit institutions. In fact, there'll be a webinar next month that will talk about the role of bond financing as among other sources of financing for a public housing project in Washington, D.C. Non-recourse project finance. I'd like to say a little bit more about this. This is just beginning to happen in low and moderate income communities. Non-recourse project financing meaning that the property owner, there's no direct recourse to that property owner for the loan obligation. Let me talk a little bit about Marcus Garvey Apartments in East Brooklyn. This is a 625 affordable housing unit project in the Brownsville community of East Brooklyn. It was completed in last year. The services that are provided by the solar and storage system are for demand management, again, as Seth said, to reduce demand charges. But also it does generate demand response revenue for the property owner and provides backup power, resilient power for the tenants. It's a 400 kW solar system. The storage system is 300 kW of power and 1200 kW of capacity, kW hours of capacity. The owner of the apartments is L&M Development Partners. The battery storage was financed by NYCEEC, New York City Energy Efficiency Corporation. I'll say a little bit about how they did this. The battery and solar system, the Solar+Storage system, as well as a fuel cell system for the property, was designed and developed by Demand Energy. And Con Edison was important for writing down the cost of the system through the BQDM, Brooklyn Queens Demand Management area incentives for avoiding additional upgrades that they would have otherwise had to do to the grid in Brooklyn, in that particular area. So this was a way of them deferring costs as connected with having a substation and other infrastructure development. So the NYCEEC financing here was the loan was made to a special purpose entity that was created by Demand Energy, which was the project developer, and they split off the battery from the solar portion of the project. So there was an SPE created just for the battery in this instance. It doesn't have to be done that way, but that's how it was done in this instance. Total cost of that the battery system was $32 million. 95% financing was provided by NYCEEC, again with no recourse to any of the other parties. Only the special purpose entity was obligated. It was a 10.5-year loan for construction for 6 months, and then converted into a term loan. The proceeds were for the fixed assets, the equipment, and for the installation. And the loan was secured by those assets, battery storage equipment, but also by the storage-related incentives, which were paid in over time. Mostly front-loaded, but paid over about a 2-3 year period of time. And then the revenue from the demand response payments was also obligated. So primary sources of repayment here were the incentives, the Con Ed incentives, demand response payments for making power available when called upon by both the ISO, by New York ISO, and by the grid operator, and by the utility, Con Ed, and then the peak shaving utility savings, those demand charge reductions. We've done a webinar on the Marcus Garvey project. If you're interested, go to that web page, resilient-power.org, and it's archived there. You can also just pull down the slides if you want to take a look at them. So let me say a word about more about a couple other resources that could be useful for those who are interested in financing projects. We did a Resilient Power Capital Scan last year, which was commissioned by the Kresge Foundation, by CERDA Foundation, by JPV Foundation. We were asked to take a look and identify some key barriers that are in the way of more rapidly deploying solar plus storage, resilient power in low-income communities, and also suggest ways that foundations could be supportive and make a difference in accelerating the deployment of those technologies. So, some of the barriers are that there really is not a flexible, integrated financing platform that project developers can readily access in low-income communities. That the financing is actually directed more towards C&I customers that are strong and creditworthy and are cookie cutter in terms of the application for specific use. And also that there's a strong need for additional capacity building, both for financing entities that are focused on doing community development work and on interested in energy finance, but also for project developers and property owners who are trying to figure this out. And then we came up with over 50 recommended interventions that foundations should consider or could consider, including not just grants, obviously, but program-related investments that would be useful at this point, credit enhancement, and mission-related investment opportunities. So some of those interventions could include supporting new tax credit aggregation strategies, which is a continuing problem. The tax credit requirements of these projects are smaller than would interest a lot of conventional commercial banks or other tax equity investors. So how do you aggregate these projects or these opportunities? And then also loan guarantees and credit enhancement being very important at this point to backstop performance and financial risk. The other paper that just was issued this week is a new report called Owning the Benefits of Solar and Storage, New Ownership and Investment Models for Affordable Housing. It looks at a range of ownership and finance structures. It begins by talking about immediate direct ownership, which provides the greatest control to a community development organization or to community residents, where the solar and storage system is purchased and owned outright by the property owner. However, that's not readily available in the sense that they're, people may not have the capacity to buy something outright. There may not be the grants available or the ability to finance directly by property owners. So there are other ownership structures that should be considered, we think, as a way of gaining control of those benefits and in time establishing ownership of those assets in some instances. And for instance, third-party ownership flips. This is where a third-party entity initially owns the Solar+Storage assets until the tax equity investors' tax incentives have been fully used, at which point the ownership flips to the property owner. Or a variation on that, third-party ownership flips where, but you're using an affiliated entity. This would be a nonprofit or public purpose entity that owns the assets initially and then flips those assets to or retains it and instead of the assets, I should say, being transferred to the property owner at the end of the tax benefits being exhausted, they are transferred to an affiliated public purpose entity that continues to service those assets and provides strong terms to the favorable terms to the property owner. And then there's civic PACE. It talks about that, a civic PACE with a third-party ownership structure, and also third-party ownership under a utility contracted payment for services agreement. So there'll be a webinar discussing the findings of this paper on March 29th. Again, you can register for that on that webpage I mentioned before, resilient-power.org. And we'll be going through a couple case studies in DC and in California at that time. So that's what I have. Over to you, Jonas, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate it. Happy to be here, everybody. Get the slides going here, and then I'll present. My name is Jonas Villalba. I'm with Promise Energy, and we provide solar solutions for affordable housing. Most of our customers are based in the California market right now, although we're evolving to other markets as well. A lot of the use case examples we'll be talking about today will be related to projects we're seeing here in California. So from our perspective, the energy storage use case examples cover, an AC coupled solution for resiliency. We've got projects that have compliance requirements related to meeting the needs of programs such as the USDA or Living Building Challenge that are requiring communities, affordable housing communities, to provide some sense of resiliency or backup for projects in the case of long-term outages. We've seen a lot of use cases recently due to weather where energy storage would have provided, in some projects we're seeing, as an example, the ability to keep a refrigerator running for the residents' medicines or provide battery power for folks to charge their cell phones. So the resiliency component is really important, and that's we've actually seen that on several projects coming through more and more. The other use case scenario is for a DC coupled energy storage solution, and that's really for peak shaving and load management. So this is referencing what Seth discussed earlier. Typically, utility bills are comprised of a couple of different components. One is the energy, the kilowatt hour. The other is the demand charge. And so using the solar storage for offsetting those demand charges is another use case. Two different ways to integrate a battery into an affordable housing project. None of it happens correctly unless you have access to really important energy consumption data. So the evolution for us, Promise Energy, making the shift from, or actually incorporating energy storage in addition to solar energy services, is really getting a good understanding of how a building consumes energy in interval time periods, so typically 15-minute interval periods. So the old days of solar, we always asked ourselves, okay, how many kilowatt hours does a building use over a 12-month period of time, knowing that a solar system would produce more of those kilowatt hours in the summertime and less in the wintertime, and utilizing financial mechanisms or agreements with the utility company called net metering, you could essentially store your energy credits, excess credits that were produced during the day or peak times in the summer, and offset your bill at nighttime or other times of the year. As Seth discussed, the utility companies are evolving to the way that they're charging for energy, and we're seeing a larger shift into demand charges, which the solar won't help offset those demand charges. So integration of solar plus storage will help protect these affordable housing facilities from the increases in demand charges. So in order to understand those benefits of solar plus storage, again, it comes down to the data. There's new technologies front that are providing that data for these facilities, and Promise Energy is engaging in that data creation and data collection opportunities. The reality, what we've learned in this process of integrating these new solar projects is that solar is, to be blunt, solar is dumb, and most storage is dumb as well. What you need is a brain. So solar produces energy when the sun's out. Storage discharges energy when something tells it to do so. We found that many of the storage solutions available today don't have a brain, and they don't know when to discharge. A lot of solutions do have a brain, and they do know when to discharge, but there's a sharp difference between a storage system that has management behind it and a solar and storage system that doesn't have management. So you need to have the management capacity to optimize the energy spend based on how a particular facility is being charged for that electricity. So Promise Energy is engaged with an energy cloud platform called NAK. NAK uses an energy management smart hub out of Australia called Carbon Track. And the smart hub essentially is a device that's mounted out next to the electrical panel. And in the California market, we're lucky because we can get that 15-minute interval data readily from the 3 investor-owned utility companies, which covers more than 90% of the state. In markets that don't have that energy data available, we install the Smart Hub device, and it actually creates that data for us. And we call that every building has its own energy fingerprint. So understanding how that building consumes energy throughout the day is really important because it educates that decision as to how to size the battery, for example. If you understand what the demand curve is during certain times of the day, you need to understand how big the battery needs to be to offset that energy to maximize the demand savings. And so with NAK and Energy Cloud Platform, we're able to capture that data and use that data to inform the decisions. We also use the green button interval data from the utility companies to do the same thing. What's great about NAK is once the Smart Hub is installed, it actually does act as that brain for the inverter on the battery. It also communicates and acts as the brain for the inverter on the solar PV system as well. Additionally, it communicates through Zigbee and wireless technologies to turn certain circuits on and off. So the idea is that demand management with the battery occurs when you can, discharge the battery to offset a certain load on the building. Energy management with the NAK Smart Hub and the Carbon Track device, we can actually affect that demand management by turning circuits on and off. And so when you have a solar plus storage in the brain, like NAK, then during the day, the excess solar generation can be sent to the battery to be used at nighttime when the sun is down. And so when you pair that capacity with a brain that actually understands how much your electricity costs at any moment during the day, then you're able to control, that's a really important capacity, capabilities to control the energy storage system, the different loads in the house, and maximize your energy spend. You're optimizing the solar, you're optimizing the battery, and then you're even doing load shifting with something as simple as turning on the pool pump. And so this is sort of the next phase of solar plus storage. From our perspective, is the idea to do energy management in conjunction with. So this came out pretty small. I wonder if I can speak to this. It's pretty small here. So we have a few different use case projects. The first project is called Rancho Verde Farm Workers. It's here in California. This is we used an AC coupled battery system. We used the Sonnen solution on this project. This was a USDA funded low income housing tax credit project. And in order to meet the requirements of the USDA funding, they had to provide energy storage for resiliency. So we engaged the Sonnen Eco Pack batteries in the community room at the project, and we are tied into we've created an essential loads panel. So any of the circuits that are in this essential loads panel are also tied to the battery. And in case of and there's also a solar PV system on the project as well. That is also tied to the battery. So, to the essential loads panel. And so thank you, that's perfect. So there's an automatic transfer switch. In the event that the grid goes down for extended period of time, the automatic transfer switch will engage the Sonnen battery, and because the solar energy is also tied to the essential loads panel, you essentially create a perpetual energy source where the solar energy can be used to provide power to any circuit in the essential load panel, or it can be used to fill up the battery as well. So that's a pretty standard use case scenario for the Sonnen solution. It's a very elegant design. I think Seth showed a picture of one from the Vermont project, and it is installed inside the community room in an air-conditioned space. A nice looking unit, in my opinion. Next project we are working on is Mosaic Gardens, Pomona. It's with Link Housing. It's a Southern California Edison pilot program. This project we're utilizing, a 30 kilowatt, 60 kilowatt hour energy storage battery. This is a unit that is tied into the common area of a multifamily building. It's a single building, and this is essentially going to provide resiliency for the common area meter. The interconnection for the battery is a single common area meter, and so we are working with the utility company to understand what the effects of the utility bill will be when you have the ability to have a battery offset demand, offset load, and in that instance, for the common area meter, there would also be a resiliency component that is available for that project. Lastly, the third project we're working on is the Silver Star Apartments. It's located in the city of Los Angeles. This is a very, very efficient net zero living building challenge certification project, and we are installing in external closets energy storage units that are AC coupled. The sole purpose of this project is for resiliency as well, sort of similar to the Rancho Verde project. It's going to offset community room usage and provide long-term resiliency by providing power to a refrigerator and so on. What I wanted to talk about on regarding these projects, there's a lot of details here, and not to get into the nuances of the details of these projects. Some of the challenges or lessons learned regarding these projects were interesting, and so I wanted to discuss a couple of the things we learned in these projects deployment. So number one, permitting is always a challenge. It's a challenge because we're dealing with new technologies and a lot of authority AHJs that are new to understanding what energy storage is, how it's interconnected, and what it's going to do. And so what ways to get around some of those challenges are to incorporate solutions like Sonnen, which are fully packaged UL certified solutions. There are a lot of energy storage solutions that are piecemealed, and they're not UL certified as a single unit, and thus you'll run into some challenges in certain AHJs because it's not considered a single certified unit. Another challenge we had was in affordable housing. There's a couple different project types. There's central single building projects with internal electrical rooms that are often conditioned or covered from the elements. So finding space for their energy storage is always a challenge in a retrofit scenario. The reality for us is that most of our projects are what we call campus-style multi-buildings, walk-ups, and in most cases you have a campus-style facility with a bunch of separate buildings. You are actually, if you're trying to interconnect energy storage to a meter and you have 10 buildings, you're looking at interconnecting at 10 separate meters. So there's a lot of nuances there related to the ability to use components like virtual net metering to offset those benefits, but from just a mechanical interconnection capacity in a standard campus-style affordable housing project facility, most of the time the utility interconnection points are located outdoors, and thus it's difficult to find energy storage devices that are rated for outdoor installation. It's not that they don't exist, but they're further and few in between, and that was a challenge. The other challenge is that, you know, affordable housing typically is, especially in these scattered sites, the phase and voltage. So most of the projects that you'll see with energy storage are commercial projects. They're 3-phase, 480 volt projects. Most of the energy storage solutions are either sort of fit for a large scale demand management 480 volt 3-phase installation, or they're designed for a single phase, smaller residential energy storage solution. Where affordable housing lands 75% of the time in our experiences in that 208 volt 3-phase scenario, where there's very, very limited energy storage solutions without using a 480 volt 3-phase battery and a step down transformer, which becomes very costly and absorbs some of the energy. You lose efficiency by doing a step down transformer. So if you're doing that on a single interconnection, that's okay. But if you're doing that for 10 separate sites, you increase your cost significantly and you lose a lot of that efficiency. So those are some of the challenges we had. The last thing I'll say is our understanding from the tax credit availability is that 75% of the solar battery needs to be charged. 75% of the energy storage unit needs to be charged by the solar. And so there's use cases where that can be difficult from a resiliency perspective versus a demand management perspective. So there's some the devil in details there. And then the demand in the current marketplace right now, demand charge reality is for our projects in affordable housing with a scattered campus style unit, you're spreading that demand across 10 separate meters. Thus, most of the meters on a campus style project don't feature a demand style rate tariff structure, and so you have to really evaluate if the battery can provide demand savings in every instance. So there's some details to dig into. The moral of the story is the energy data, the electricity fingerprint will answer all those questions. So start with your data and come up with your solutions after that. I'll leave it there and open it up for questions and anybody else.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Jonas, and thanks to Seth and Rob too for your presentations. So we've got your presentations have generated a lot of questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we can before the top of the hour. The first question goes to Seth or Jonas. So you're a commercial building owner. Absent the NAC Smart Hub, how do you go about getting your hands on the 15-minute interval demand data?
I'll take that one. First step is I would essentially go to my local utility provider and look up 2 ways. So you can look up the standard 15-minute interval data. It's called green button data. That's a national standard set by the federal government. So you can go to greenbuttondata.org and see if your utility company is listed as somebody who partakes in that data program, and if not, then you need some sort of an on-site monitoring solution to provide that data.
Yeah, and I'll just add, you know, as Jonas said, data is key, and lack of access to that data is something that we've run into again and again with folks. California is pretty good about providing that data. Other places, it depends. You know, lacking that, there are some default load profiles that have been developed that you can use to try to get some kind of sense of what the 15-minute load profile will look like for different building types. But it's certainly no comparison to having the actual data there.
Great, thanks. Seth, another question for you. You sort of mentioned regulatory risk and using storage as a way to sort of hedge against some of the potential net metering changes and the like. Is there a risk utilities will change the rules so that demand charges will be covered by another line item and negate some of the benefit of storage solutions?
Yeah, sure. There's a risk for storage the way that tariffs are structured, just the same way that there is for solar. The good thing about storage, again, Jonas said that both solar and storage are pretty dumb technologies, but storage has a lot of flexibility when you have a management system that can respond to a lot of different tariff structures. So unless the shift is really to fixed charges, which there's hard to do anything about that, the choice for utilities tends to really be between time of use rate structures, where energy costs more at different times of the day, or demand charges, where you're charged for your demand in a day. There's not a whole lot of other options that today, at least, utilities are using to recoup or generate their revenue. So energy storage is flexible enough that it can respond to both of those. So again, unless it's a shift towards something like fixed charges, which you can't do anything about, storage tends to be flexible enough that it can respond to changes in tariffs.
Great, thanks. Rob, here's a question for you, or maybe really two questions, but they're related. Can you review how a nonprofit organization can leverage the tax credits for Solar+Storage? And also, can you also just sort of explicate the civic PACE model and how that differs from standard commercial PACE?
Right. A nonprofit organization or a municipality doesn't pay taxes on. What has to happen if those tax exempt entities are going to get the economic benefit of tax credits or accelerated depreciation or whatever, is that they need to have some sort of structure where somebody who does have a tax appetite is owning the assets, and then either the ownership of those assets then revert through some flip structure that's identified up front to the property owner, or that there's a continuing PPA throughout the economic life of this Solar+Storage system. But the key is that the tax-exempt entity should share in the economic benefits that are provided by the tax incentives, and that's right now a lot of the PPAs that are arranged that are conventional or leasing structures. They're sort of like black boxes. You can't really tell what the cost of financing is. You can't tell what the fees are that the financing provider, that the entity is providing. What we're seeing beginning to happen is these PPAs are being more transparent, especially if tax-exempt entities are providing some sort of additional incentives or grant funds, or if it's an affiliated entity that's the third-party owner of the assets, then there's a more equitable sharing of those economic benefits. And that's why you're seeing a lot of work being done on standardized PPAs that are much more open to understanding what the underlying assumptions and business aspects of the transaction are. The civic PACE is a kind of commercial PACE transaction. It's simply focused on tax-exempt property owners, and so it uses Blocker Corporation or a third-party entity that has tax equity investors owning those assets, and then the real estate is obligated under an assessment to be the payment stream for the financing that comes through that Blocker Corporation for the Solar+Storage assets. So it really is, think of civic PACE as a PACE structure for tax-exempt properties. And some folks who've really pioneered this are Urban Ingenuity in conjunction with some other entities. But if you go on the Urban Ingenuity website, you'll see the structure explained. And also our paper talks a little bit about it, the one that just came out this week, Owning the Benefits.
Great, thanks. And we are very close, if not to the top of the hour, and we'll close out soon. I just want to get one more question in, and then I'll give our panelists a chance to have to offer up any parting thoughts. A question again back to you, Seth. You mentioned valuation of resiliency. How do you, quote, assign a resilience value to a project? Yeah,
it's a really difficult things to do, and there are different methodologies for how to do it. This analysis that we worked on with NREL, put the paper out. They used a study by Lawrence Berkeley National Lab that conducted a survey of different commercial customers, and their kind of estimation of the value of avoided losses. So it's basically putting a valuation on the costs associated with the power outage, so that could be lost man hours of work or potential business losses. These tend to be for this exercise, it was looking at short-term losses, so about 2-hour outages. So these aren't talking about the extended, multi-day outages that can have a greater impact. But because it's commercial properties, they tended to quantify, just the workforce and any business that was lost, and then the ability to avoid those outage-related losses then gives you the value of resilience that you can assign to the solar and storage system. So hopefully that makes sense.
Great, thanks. So we are a little past the hour mark, and I just want to thank our panelists, Seth, Rob, and Jonas, again for your presentations and for your good answers to these questions. And I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to get to more of these questions. Before I turn it back over to Samantha to talk about some of our upcoming webinars, I just want to give our panelists another shot at any parting thoughts they want to leave us with. So we'll take it in the order that the presenters presented in, and we'll start with you, Seth.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. Thanks for having me today. Appreciate the opportunity. And anybody that didn't have their questions answered, if it's something that I can address, then please do reach out to me. It's just Seth at cleanenergygroup.org, or go through Nate or Sam, and they can get your question to me.
That's great, really Rob. All I have is that we look forward to being able to respond to questions now, or as you think about the webinar over the next few weeks.
Great.
Yeah. So this is Jonas. Thank you, everybody, for the opportunity. I feel like we just scratched the surface on the conversation. So I'm definitely making myself available for additional questions and comments offline of the webinar. I would reiterate that for us, start with the data. Data is key. And opportunities lie in the coming time of use cases. To be blunt, from Promise Energy's perspective, in the California market in the near future, our entire sort of the way we look at a project will evolve to understanding the need for energy based on the time of day, and we will ultimately, as a market, I believe, be sizing batteries to meet the load when the electricity costs the most, and then we'll be sizing the solar to do nothing more than fill up that battery to optimize the energy spend. So kind of a short way of saying it, but that's, I think, where the market's heading. So I'll leave everybody with that.
Great. Well, thanks again to Clean Energy Group and Promise Energy, and thanks to all of you in the audience for tuning in. Samantha, I'll turn it over to you to tell us about a couple of upcoming webinars and to close out.
Great, thank you, Nate. So on the screen now, you should see some info about a couple of upcoming webinars that we have. The next one is on Thursday, March 1st, and that is on promising solar PV financing strategies for low and moderate income customers. And then on Thursday, March 29th, at the end of the month, we have a webinar on a very similar topic to what we spoke about today, new financing options for solar plus storage in low-income communities. So you can read more about these webinars at CESA.org/webinars. You can register there free, just as this webinar was today, and we will have a lot of interesting information presented in those. So again, please do check out our website for info on that. And I will leave you with some contact info for our webinar host, Nate Hausman, and also a link to our project website, cesa.org/projects/sustainable-solar, and some links to our website and our social media pages where you can stay in touch and see what else we're up to. So thank you everybody for joining us for this webinar today. We hope to see you at the next one. Bye.